Long before the first cities carved their names into clay, before kings learned to measure power in walls and weapons, there existed a story so old it feels older than memory itself. It speaks of a world where gods walked among dust and stars alike, where desire shaped fate, and where the boundary between heaven and earth was thin enough to cross. What if the origins of civilization were not forged only by conquest and order, but by passion, defiance, and sacred transgression? What if the oldest truths were never meant to be comfortable? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. Long before stone walls rose from the river plains of southern Mesopotamia, before kings carved their names into monuments meant to outlast time, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates was already alive with meaning. It was a place where mud became brick, where water carved order out of chaos, and where human memory began to stretch beyond the limits of a single lifetime. In this world, divinity was not distant. The gods were not abstractions, but presences, felt in the wind, heard in thunder, seen in the swelling of rivers and the shining of stars. Among them, one figure emerged with a force so magnetic that her name would echo across millennia: Inanna. She was not born quietly into the pantheon. She arrived as a convergence of contradictions, a deity who embodied opposites without apology. Love and war, fertility and destruction, desire and death all moved within her. In a world still learning to define itself, Inanna became the mirror in which humanity first recognized its own complexity. Her story begins not in mythic abstraction, but in the soil of early civilization, in the city of Uruk, one of the first true urban centers the world had ever known. Uruk rose from the southern plains of Mesopotamia during the 4th millennium BCE, a place of canals, temples, and crowded streets where human society crossed a threshold from village life into urban existence. Here, people learned to organize labor, record transactions, and imagine power beyond the individual. And at the center of this transformation stood Inanna, whose temple complex dominated the city both physically and spiritually. Her presence was not symbolic alone. It was administrative, economic, and political. Offerings flowed into her sanctuary. Priests and priestesses managed vast estates in her name. Through her, divine authority fused with human governance. From the earliest clay tablets, scratched with the first hesitant forms of writing, her name appears again and again. These tablets do not yet tell stories in the modern sense. They list offerings, record inventories, note transactions. But even in these dry records, one fact is unmistakable. Inanna already stood at the heart of organized life. Her symbol, the 8-pointed star, marked goods, temples, and authority itself. She was not a myth added later to explain the world. She was there from the beginning, embedded in its structure. Unlike many later deities who were neatly assigned limited roles, Inanna refused to be contained. She was the goddess of love, but not domestic love. She was the goddess of war, but not merely violence. She was desire itself, creative, destructive, destabilizing. She embodied the forces that drove people to build cities and tear them down, to create laws, and then challenge them. In her, the Mesopotamians recognized a truth about existence that remains unsettling even now. Creation and destruction are not opposites, but partners. The people of early Sumer did not imagine their gods as distant moral judges. Their deities were powerful, emotional, and deeply involved in the affairs of the world. Inanna, more than any other, reflected the unpredictable intensity of human experience. She loved fiercely, punished brutally, and pursued her will with relentless determination. She was not bound by the expectations placed upon women in later societies. She was neither obedient daughter nor nurturing mother by default. She chose her own path, and that choice defined her. Her earliest worship reveals a goddess already fully formed. Archaeological evidence suggests that Inanna's cult may predate the Sumerians themselves, possibly inherited from older, pre-literate cultures of the region. Her name does not easily break down into known Sumerian linguistic components, hinting at origins deeper than recorded history. To the people who adopted her, she was not invented, she was discovered. A force already present, waiting to be named. In the earliest myths, Inanna is inseparable from the city of Uruk. The city was not merely her home, it was an extension of her identity. Its walls, temples, and marketplaces reflected her nature. Uruk was vibrant, ambitious, competitive, and restless, qualities mirrored in its goddess. Where other deities ruled over static domains, Inanna ruled over change itself. Her presence marked moments of transition, from girlhood to adulthood, from peace to war, from order to chaos. This association with transformation made her both revered and feared. To invoke Inanna was to invite intensity. She was known to grant immense power, but also to demand a price. Her favor could elevate kings and shatter enemies, yet it could also destroy those who failed to respect her autonomy. Unlike many gods who operated through intermediaries, Inanna acted directly. She intervened. She took offense. She desired. In the ancient imagination, she was often depicted adorned with symbols of authority, crown, weapons, and regalia, standing atop lions, creatures that embodied both majesty and danger. The lion was not merely her companion, but an extension of her essence. Untamed strength held barely in check. In art and hymn alike, this imagery reinforced the message that Inanna could not be controlled. She could only be approached with reverence and caution. What made her truly extraordinary, however, was not just her power, but her autonomy. In a pantheon where many gods derived authority through lineage or function, Inanna defined herself. She did not inherit her position quietly. She claimed it. Her myths repeatedly emphasize motion. She travels, she descends, she ascends, she takes. She is never passive. Even when constrained, she acts. Even when defeated, she returns. This restless energy mirrored the experience of early urban life itself. Cities brought opportunity, wealth, and innovation, but also conflict, inequality, and anxiety. Inanna embodied both sides of this transformation. She was the promise of abundance and the threat of upheaval. Through her, the people of ancient Mesopotamia could understand the contradictions of their world without resolving them. To worship Inanna was to accept complexity. She could not be reduced to a single moral lesson or simple narrative. Her myths do not offer comfort so much as confrontation. They force their listeners to grapple with the reality that creation often requires destruction, that desire carries risk, and that power is never neutral. In this way, Inanna stands at the beginning of a long tradition of divine figures who reflect humanity's deepest contradictions. She is not a symbol to be decoded and set aside, but a presence that demands engagement. The world she inhabits is one where divinity and humanity overlap, where the sacred is entangled with the physical, and where meaning arises not from certainty but from tension. This is the world into which we now step, a world where gods walk among mortals, where cities rise under the gaze of a goddess who is at once lover, warrior, and queen. To understand Inanna is to understand the roots of civilization itself, not as a story of steady progress, but as a turbulent dance between order and chaos, desire and restraint, creation and destruction. And it is here, at the threshold of that ancient world, that her story truly begins. In the earliest days of written memory, when humanity first learned to mark thought into clay, the figure of Inanna already stood fully formed, neither emerging nor evolving, but present as if she had always been there. The earliest inscriptions do not describe her birth or origin. They simply acknowledge her presence. This absence of an origin story is itself revealing. While other gods were traced through genealogies and cosmic lineages, Inanna appeared as a force that did not need explanation. She existed before explanation was required. Her power was not derived, it was assumed. The people of early Sumer did not imagine their gods as distant architects of creation. Divinity lived among them, shaped the soil, governed the rhythms of work and rest, and intervened directly in human affairs. Inanna's domain encompassed precisely those areas where human emotion and ambition burned brightest. She was the goddess of erotic desire, of political power, of war, and of the unpredictable forces that bind these realms together. Where other deities ruled over fixed natural phenomena, Inanna ruled over movement, between states, between identities, between worlds. Her earliest temples were not quiet places of contemplation. They were centers of activity, filled with music, offerings, ritual drama, and the constant flow of people seeking favor or guidance. Inanna was worshipped not in isolation, but in the heart of the city, where economic, religious, and political life overlapped. The temple complex known as the Eanna, meaning House of Heaven, stood at the core of Uruk not only as a sacred site, but as an administrative hub. From here, goods were distributed, labor organized, and authority legitimized in her name. This integration of divine worship with civic life reveals something essential about how the Sumerians understood power. Authority did not descend from distant abstractions. It was embodied, personal, and relational. To rule effectively, a king had to stand in the favor of Inanna. Without her approval, no authority was secure. Her favor could elevate a shepherd to kingship or reduce a ruler to nothing. She was not bound by tradition or obligation. She chose. The myths surrounding Inanna emphasize this autonomy repeatedly. She is not born into subservience. She does not wait to be assigned dominion. Instead, she takes what she desires through intelligence, charisma, and daring. Her strength is not brute force, but audacity. This made her both admired and feared, especially in a society that valued order and continuity. Inanna represented the disruptive energy that drives change, the necessary chaos that precedes creation. One of the most striking features of her character is her relationship to gender. In a world where social roles were rigidly defined, Inanna moved freely between them. She embodied both masculine and feminine traits without contradiction. She could be nurturing or violent, seductive or terrifying. Her priesthood reflected this fluidity, incorporating individuals who did not conform to conventional gender roles. Through her, the boundaries of identity were not erased, but made permeable. This fluidity was not seen as a threat to order, but as an expression of cosmic truth. Just as the sky changes and the seasons turn, so too could identity shift and transform. Inanna represented the living principle that nothing in existence is static. Everything is in motion, and to resist that motion is to resist life itself. Her association with the planet Venus reinforced this symbolism. Venus appears in the sky as both the morning star and the evening star, disappearing and returning in a cycle that ancient observers found deeply meaningful. To the Sumerians, this was not a coincidence, but a manifestation of Inanna's power. She moved between realms, vanished and reappeared, died and returned. Her celestial journey mirrored her mythic descent into the underworld and her return to the world of the living. This cyclical pattern became one of the defining features of her mythos. Inanna was never static. She descended and ascended, conquered and submitted, loved and destroyed. Her stories did not move in straight lines, but in loops, reflecting a worldview in which time itself was cyclical rather than linear. Seasons returned, life followed death, and the same divine dramas played out again and again with subtle variations. In the human realm, this translated into rituals that reenacted her myths year after year. Through song, dance, and ceremonial drama, communities participated in her stories, not as passive observers, but as active participants. These rituals were not symbolic reenactments, but acts believed to sustain the cosmic order. By honoring Inanna's journeys, people ensured the continuity of life itself. Her presence was especially powerful in moments of transition. She presided over rites of passage, over the crossing from youth to adulthood, from life to death, from chaos to order. Inanna was invoked in childbirth and warfare alike, both moments when the boundary between life and death was at its thinnest. To call upon her was to acknowledge the risk inherent in transformation. Unlike many later religious figures, Inanna did not offer moral absolutes or ethical commandments. She did not promise salvation or demand obedience in exchange for protection. Her relationship with humanity was dynamic, sometimes nurturing, sometimes destructive, but always honest in its intensity. She demanded engagement, not submission. This quality made her deeply compelling to the people who worshipped her. They saw in her not a distant judge, but a reflection of their own struggles and desires. Inanna experienced jealousy, rage, love, ambition, and grief. She failed and triumphed. She made mistakes and bore their consequences. In this way, she was profoundly relatable, even as she remained divine. Her myths do not seek to comfort but to reveal. They present a world in which power is dangerous, desire is transformative, and survival requires both strength and adaptability. Inanna does not promise safety, she offers vitality. She is the force that drives civilizations to rise and fall, that pushes individuals beyond their limits, that ensures nothing remains stagnant for long. To understand Inanna is to understand that the ancient world did not separate the sacred from the chaotic. The same force that brought fertility could bring destruction. The same goddess who blessed love could unleash war. This was not a contradiction to be resolved, but a truth to be accepted. In this sense, Inanna stands as one of the most psychologically complex figures in ancient mythology. She embodies the full spectrum of human experience, unfiltered and unapologetic. Her myths do not comfort us with simple morals. They challenge us to confront the realities of power, desire, and transformation. As the narrative of her life unfolds, her actions will lead her into realms no other deity dares to enter. She will test the limits of divine authority, confront death itself, and return changed. But before those journeys unfold, it is essential to understand the foundation upon which they rest. A goddess born not of submission, but of will, not of order alone, but of the volatile energies that make order possible. In the world of Inanna, nothing is stable and nothing is safe. Yet within that instability lies creation itself. And it is into this world, dangerous, luminous, and alive, that her story now fully unfolds. Inanna's power did not remain confined to the temples of Uruk or the boundaries of ritual devotion. As her influence spread, so too did the stories that attempted to capture her essence, each revealing another facet of a deity who could not be contained within a single role. Among these narratives, none carried more weight than the tale of her descent into the realm beneath the earth, a journey that would redefine the boundaries between life and death and expose the cost of divine ambition. The underworld of Mesopotamian belief was not a place of moral judgment or eternal punishment. It was a realm of stillness, dust, and silence, where all the dead, great and small, were reduced to the same shadowed existence. Ruled by Ereshkigal, the queen of the great below, it was a domain governed by immutable laws. Once entered, it wasn't meant to be left. For a living god to descend, there was an act of staggering defiance, a violation of cosmic order that threatened the balance of existence itself. Yet Inanna chose to go. The myths do not present her descent as an accident or a punishment. It is a deliberate decision, undertaken with full awareness of its danger. Some traditions suggest she sought to expand her dominion, to claim authority even over death itself. Others imply a deeper motive, a need to confront her shadow, to face the forces that defined the limits of her power. Whatever her reasons, she prepared meticulously, dressing herself in the full regalia of divinity before setting out. Each piece of her adornment represented authority: her crown, her breastplate, her necklace, her rings. These were not mere ornaments, but manifestations of power, symbols of the roles she embodied. Clothed in her full regalia, Inanna approached the gates of the underworld, announcing herself not as a supplicant, but as a queen. She demanded entry, invoking her status and lineage, confident that her authority would carry her through. The underworld did not respond as the heavens did. At each of the 7 gates she was halted and required to surrender one piece of her regalia. With every threshold crossed, she was stripped further of her power, her identity, her divine protection. The process was methodical, ritualized, and merciless. By the time she reached the throne of Ereshkigal, Inanna stood naked and defenseless, reduced to her most vulnerable state. This stripping was not merely physical, it represented the gradual dismantling of status, ego, and illusion. Each gate removed an aspect of the self that defined authority and separation. What remained was essence alone. In that moment, Inanna was no longer queen, goddess, or conqueror. She was simply being. Ereshkigal, ruler of the dead, did not welcome her. She met Inanna not with words, but with judgment. The laws of the underworld were absolute, and they did not bend for kinship or power. The judges of the dead turned their gaze upon Inanna, and with that gaze she was struck down. Her body was rendered lifeless and hung upon a hook like a piece of meat, a stark image of mortality stripped of dignity. The goddess who once commanded heavens and cities lay inert, her power extinguished. Above, the world began to feel the consequences. Fertility waned, desire faded. Life itself seemed to slow, as if the pulse of existence had faltered. The absence of Inanna was not merely symbolic, it was catastrophic. Yet even in death, the patterns of preparation she had set in motion continued to unfold. Before her descent, she had instructed her loyal servant, Ninshubur, to seek help if she did not return. True to her word, Ninshubur carried out her duties with unwavering devotion. She went first to the great gods, pleading for intervention. One by one, they refused. Some cited the inviolable laws of the underworld, others feared the consequences of interference. Only Enki, the god of wisdom and creation, responded differently. He did not argue or condemn, he acted. From the dirt beneath his fingernails, he shaped two small beings, neither male nor female, neither living nor dead. These creatures, immune to the laws that bound gods and mortals alike, were sent into the underworld bearing the food and water of life. Their journey was quiet, unnoticed. When they reached Ereshkigal, they did not challenge her authority or demand the release of Inanna. Instead, they mirrored her suffering. They moaned when she moaned, cried when she cried, offering empathy rather than opposition. This act of recognition softened her rage. Moved by their compassion, she granted them a gift. They asked for the body of Inanna. Bound by her own word, Ereshkigal allowed it. The beings sprinkled the water and food of life upon the lifeless goddess, and Inanna rose again. But resurrection came at a cost. The laws of the underworld demanded balance. No one could leave unless another took their place. The debt had to be paid. Accompanied by demonic attendants, Inanna returned to the world above, but she did not return alone. She was followed by the emissaries of the underworld, searching for a substitute. One by one, they encountered those who had mourned her, her servants, her companions, her faithful attendants. Each time, Inanna refused to surrender them. Their loyalty had earned her protection. Finally, she came upon Dumuzi, her consort, seated on his throne, dressed in finery, unmoved by her absence. He had not mourned her. He had not torn his clothes or covered himself in ash. In that moment, Inanna's compassion hardened into judgment. She pointed to him, and the demons seized him as her replacement. This act has often been interpreted as cruelty, but it reveals a deeper logic. Dumuzi, as the embodiment of fertile abundance, was bound to the cycles of growth and decay. His descent into the underworld mirrored the dying of vegetation in the dry season, just as his eventual return would signal renewal. In condemning him, Inanna enacted the balance that sustained the natural world. Thus was established the rhythm of death and rebirth, loss and return. The cycle did not erase suffering, but it gave it meaning. The descent of Inanna and the fate of Dumuzi became a sacred drama, reenacted through ritual and song, embodying the eternal rhythm of life's renewal through sacrifice. In this myth, Inanna emerges not as a benevolent savior, but as a force of profound transformation. She does not rescue without cost. She does not preserve without destruction. Her power lies in her willingness to confront darkness, to descend into it, and to return changed. Through her, the ancient world articulated a truth that remains unsettling. Creation is inseparable from loss, and renewal demands sacrifice. The descent into darkness is not an aberration, but a necessity. Inanna's journey teaches that life persists not by denying death, but by passing through it. In this way, she stands as one of the most complex and enduring figures of human imagination, a goddess who embodies both the terror and the promise of transformation, and whose story continues to echo wherever humans confront the limits of power, desire, and survival. After her return from the depths, Inanna was no longer simply a goddess of passion and power. She had crossed a threshold no other deity had dared to cross and survived. The descent had reshaped her, carving into her being a knowledge that could not be undone. From that moment forward, she embodied not only life and desire, but the terrible understanding of mortality itself. The world she re-entered was the same in form, yet irrevocably changed in meaning. Nothing that lived beneath her gaze could remain untouched by the knowledge that even the divine could fall and rise again. In the wake of her return, the balance of the cosmos shifted. The seasons began to move with a new rhythm, reflecting the rhythm of her absence and return. When Dumuzi descended to the underworld in her place, the land withered. When he was released, life surged back into the fields. This cycle was not metaphorical to the ancient mind. It was reality made visible. The earth's barrenness in the dry months and its renewal in the spring were not natural accidents but divine consequences of cosmic negotiation. Inanna's role in this cycle positioned her as mediator between extremes. She stood at the threshold between fertility and desolation, between presence and absence. Unlike deities who ruled over fixed domains, she moved through them, binding them together through her own experience. Her power did not lie in stability, but in transformation. She did not prevent suffering, she gave it meaning. As her cult expanded, this understanding of Inanna became deeply embedded in ritual practice. Festivals reenacted her descent and return, not as distant myth, but as lived experience. Mourners wailed for her absence, echoing the ancient grief of the earth itself. Later, celebration erupted as her return was proclaimed, restoring joy and vitality. These rituals did not merely commemorate myth. They reactivated it, ensuring that the cycle of loss and renewal continued unbroken. Inanna's identity as a goddess of paradox grew increasingly complex. She was simultaneously life-giver and life-taker, nurturer and destroyer. Unlike deities bound to moral absolutes, she existed beyond simple ethical categories. Her actions were not judged by moral righteousness, but by necessity and consequence. She was neither benevolent nor cruel in any consistent sense. She was inevitable. This ambiguity unsettled later cultures that inherited her myths. As societies became more rigid in their moral frameworks, Inanna's contradictions posed a challenge. Attempts were made to soften her edges, to reinterpret her as a goddess of love alone, or to subordinate her to male deities who embodied order and law. Yet traces of her older, wilder self persisted, embedded in ritual language and mythic memory. One of the most enduring expressions of her complexity lies in her relationship to power. Unlike many gods whose authority was static, Inanna's power was earned, contested, and renewed. She seized it, lost it, reclaimed it. Her authority was dynamic, reflecting the volatile realities of human governance in the ancient world. Kings rose and fell, cities flourished and collapsed, but Inanna endured because she embodied that very instability. Her worship extended beyond formal temples into the lived experience of her people. Songs, laments, and love poems preserved her presence in everyday life. Through these texts, we see a goddess who was intimate and immediate, invoked in moments of passion, desperation, and joy. She was not distant or aloof. She was intensely present, emotionally available, and deeply involved in human affairs. Inanna's influence also reshaped how femininity was understood in the ancient world. She defied the expectation that female divinity must be passive or nurturing. Instead, she represented agency, desire, and command. Her sexuality was not a weakness, but a source of power. She chose her lovers, commanded kings, and shaped destiny through her will. In a world structured by rigid hierarchies, her figure introduced a destabilizing force that challenged assumptions about gender and authority. This challenge extended to social norms as well. The presence of gender non-conforming figures within her cult, priests and devotees who existed outside conventional roles, reflected her ability to transcend binaries. These individuals were not marginal, but sacred, embodying the liminal nature of the goddess herself. Through them, Inanna's worship acknowledged that identity, like divinity, could not be confined to rigid categories. Her influence also reshaped conceptions of justice. Unlike later moral systems that emphasized reward and punishment, Inanna's justice was situational and relational. It depended on context, intention, and balance. She did not enforce abstract laws. She responded to actions. Her judgments were immediate and often severe, yet they carried an internal logic rooted in reciprocity rather than doctrine. As her myths spread beyond Sumer into Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures, Inanna transformed but did not diminish. She became Ishtar, taking on new attributes while retaining her core identity. Her stories were retold in new languages, adapted to new political realities, yet the essence remained, a goddess who embodied the volatile forces of life itself. This adaptability ensured her survival across centuries of cultural change. While other deities faded or were absorbed, Inanna endured because she could evolve. Her myths were not static scriptures, but living narratives, reshaped by each generation to reflect their own struggles and aspirations. By the time her influence began to wane in the face of emerging monotheistic traditions, her imprint had already been etched deeply into the cultural memory of the ancient world. Traces of her can be found in later goddesses of love and war, in mythic archetypes of the dangerous feminine, in stories of descent and return that echo across cultures and eras. Inanna's legacy is not confined to the past. She persists in the patterns of human storytelling, in the fascination with characters who defy categorization, who embody contradiction, who challenge the boundaries imposed upon them. She represents the enduring truth that life is not orderly or predictable, but fierce, beautiful, and often terrifying. To encounter Inanna is to confront the full spectrum of existence without illusion. She offers no comfort without cost, no creation without destruction, no power without consequence. Yet in that harsh honesty lies her enduring relevance. She is the reminder that transformation demands courage, that rebirth requires descent, and that within chaos lies the potential for renewal. In the unfolding story of humanity, Inanna remains a force that cannot be tamed or forgotten. She is the echo of ancient voices still resonating in the modern world, calling us to remember that beneath civilization's polished surface lies the same raw energy that once shaped the first cities and the first gods. And it is in that energy, untamed and eternal, that her presence endures. As the centuries unfolded and civilizations rose and fell across the Mesopotamian plain, the figure of Inanna continued to evolve, absorbing new meanings while retaining the core of her ancient power. By the time her name transformed into Ishtar in Akkadian lands, her influence had expanded far beyond the city of Uruk. She had become a goddess not only of love and war, but of kingship itself, a divine force through which political authority was legitimized and contested. To rule without her favor was to rule on borrowed time. In royal inscriptions, kings increasingly portrayed themselves as chosen by Inanna, beloved of the goddess, warriors under her protection. This was not empty flattery. To claim her favor was to assert that one's reign was sanctioned by the deepest forces of the cosmos. In a world where divine approval meant survival, her blessing was the ultimate source of legitimacy. The king did not merely serve the gods, he acted as their agent, and among them, Inanna stood supreme in determining victory or ruin. This relationship between ruler and goddess was not symbolic alone. It was enacted through ritual, particularly in the sacred marriage ceremony that bound king and deity in a ritualized union. In this rite, the king assumed the role of Dumuzi, and a high priestess embodied Inanna herself. Through their union, the vitality of the land was renewed, and the king's right to rule was reaffirmed. The ceremony fused sexuality, politics, and religion into a single act of cosmic significance. The power of this ritual lay not in illusion, but in belief. The people believed that the land's fertility depended upon the harmony between the divine and the human. If the king failed to uphold justice or honor the goddess, famine, invasion, or disaster would follow. In this way, Inanna became both a source of authority and a standard by which rulers were judged. Her favor could exalt a king, but her wrath could undo him. As empires expanded and cultures merged, Inanna's identity adapted without losing its essence. In Akkadian tradition, she became Ishtar, a goddess of even greater ferocity and breadth. Her martial aspect grew more pronounced, reflecting the militarized societies that venerated her. She was depicted armed and battle-ready, riding into combat at the head of armies, her presence promising both glory and devastation. Yet even as her image hardened, her dual nature remained intact. She was still the goddess of love, desire, and fertility. In this duality, ancient peoples recognized a fundamental truth: creation and destruction are inseparable. The same force that brings life into being can also take it away. Inanna embodied this paradox without apology. Her myths from this period emphasize confrontation between order and chaos, restraint and excess, authority and rebellion. She appears not as a passive figure, but as an active agent who challenges boundaries. When kings failed to honor her properly, she withdrew her favor, leaving their cities vulnerable. When they sought her blessing, They did so with elaborate rituals and costly offerings, acknowledging that her power could not be taken lightly. One of the most striking aspects of Inanna's continued evolution is how she absorbed and transformed local deities as her worship spread. In many regions, local goddesses were syncretized with her, their attributes folded into her identity. This process did not dilute her character, it enriched it. Each new association added another layer to her complexity, making her less a single deity than a constellation of divine forces. This adaptability ensured her survival through centuries of political upheaval. When cities fell and dynasties collapsed, Inanna endured because she could be reinterpreted. She was never bound to a single people or place. Her essence was motion, transition, and change. Where other gods became obsolete, she transformed. Her presence in myth also served as a mirror for human psychology. The ancients saw in her the embodiment of desires they both feared and cherished. She represented the drive to transcend limitations, to pursue passion despite risk, to challenge authority even at great cost. Through her stories, societies explored the consequences of ambition and the price of transgression. This is why Inanna's myths are rarely moralistic. They do not offer clear lessons or tidy resolutions. Instead, they present scenarios in which choices carry consequences and power demands accountability. The goddess does not reward obedience. She responds to strength, daring, and authenticity. Those who approach her with fear or deceit are undone, while those who meet her on her own terms may gain extraordinary favor. Her enduring appeal lies in this refusal to conform to moral simplicity. Inanna is not a symbol of goodness or evil, but of intensity. She represents life in its fullest expression: creative, destructive, beautiful, and terrifying. Through her, the ancient world confronted the reality that existence is not governed by fairness, but by force, transformation, and resilience. As centuries passed and new religious systems emerged, traces of Inanna persisted beneath new names and forms. Her archetype resurfaced in goddesses of love and war, in myths of descent and rebirth, in stories of women who wielded power in defiance of convention. Even when her name faded, her essence endured. In the end, Inanna stands as one of humanity's earliest attempts to articulate the complexity of existence itself. She is not a comforting figure, but a truthful one. She embodies the tension between creation and destruction, order and chaos, desire and restraint. Through her, the ancient world confronted the fundamental reality that life is not gentle, but it is vibrant, transformative, and endlessly compelling. Her story does not offer redemption in the modern sense, nor does it promise peace. Instead, it offers understanding, an acceptance that life's power lies in its contradictions. To honor Inanna was to accept the world as it is, dangerous, beautiful, and alive with possibility. In this way, her legacy endures, not as a relic of a forgotten religion, but as a symbol of humanity's enduring struggle to comprehend the forces that shape existence. Inanna remains a reminder that creation is born not from order alone, but from the dynamic tension between opposing forces, a truth as relevant now as it was at the dawn of civilization. As the centuries passed and empires rose and collapsed, the figure of Inanna continued to evolve, not by losing meaning, but by accumulating it. Each generation inherited her myths and reshaped them according to its own fears, aspirations, and social realities. What remained constant was her role as a boundary figure, one who stood at the edges of order, mediating between chaos and structure, desire and restraint, life and death. In a world defined by cycles of creation and collapse, Inanna became the embodiment of continuity through transformation. Her influence extended far beyond the walls of temples and palaces. In daily life, her presence was felt in the rhythms of agriculture, in the timing of festivals, and in the intimate rituals of love and fertility. The people did not worship her from a distance. They lived within the sphere of her power. Every planting season, every harvest, every act of union echoed her myths. In this way, the divine and the mundane were inseparable. To live was to participate, knowingly or not, in her eternal drama. The priests and priestesses who served her were not merely ritual functionaries. They were mediators between worlds, embodying the liminal nature of the goddess herself. Through chants, dances, and symbolic acts, they reenacted the cosmic rhythms that sustained existence. Their rituals were not performances for an audience, but necessary acts that maintained balance between opposing forces. Without them, it was believed, the fragile harmony of the world would unravel. Among these rituals, none were more significant than those associated with transformation and renewal. Initiations, seasonal rites, and mourning ceremonies all bore the imprint of Inanna's mythology. Through these rites, individuals confronted loss, desire, and change, learning to accept transformation as an essential part of life. In this way, Inanna's influence extended beyond theology into psychology, shaping how people understood themselves and their place in the world. Her stories also functioned as a mirror for power itself. Kings who aligned themselves with Inanna did so not merely to claim divine sanction, but to tap into the dynamic force she represented. Yet this alliance was perilous. To invoke her was to invite scrutiny. She demanded courage, authenticity, and the willingness to face the consequences of ambition. Many rulers sought her favor, but few were depicted as truly worthy of it. The myths often emphasize that Inanna does not tolerate weakness disguised as authority. She exposes false power and punishes arrogance. Those who attempt to wield control without understanding its cost are brought low. In this sense, she acts as a corrective force, ensuring that power remains tied to responsibility and awareness. This aspect of her character resonated deeply in societies where kingship was both sacred and precarious. Rulers were expected to embody cosmic order, but they were also painfully aware of their vulnerability. Inanna's stories offered a framework for understanding that tension. She was the goddess who granted legitimacy, but she could also withdraw it without warning. As her worship spread beyond Sumer into Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian cultures, her image absorbed new elements while retaining its core. She became associated with military conquest, her symbols adorning banners and weapons. Yet even as a war goddess, she was never reduced to mere violence. Her battles were not mindless destruction, but expressions of transformation, violent transitions that cleared the way for new orders to emerge. In art and iconography, she was often depicted standing atop lions, creatures of immense strength and ferocity. This imagery conveyed mastery over primal forces, not their suppression. The lion was not subdued, but harnessed, mirroring how Inanna channeled chaos into creative power. Through such symbols, The ancients expressed a world view in which harmony was achieved not by eliminating conflict, but by mastering it. The persistence of Inanna's cult across centuries also speaks to her adaptability. As political structures changed, so too did her role. She could be a patron of empire or a protector of the marginalized. She could represent imperial authority or personal desire. This flexibility ensured her survival in a constantly shifting cultural landscape. Even as newer religions emerged and older gods faded into obscurity, elements of Inanna's character resurfaced in later traditions. Traces of her can be found in the archetypes of powerful goddesses, in myths of descent and rebirth, and in cultural narratives that celebrate transformation through suffering. Though her name might change, her essence endured. What sets Inanna apart from many divine figures is her refusal to be simplified. She is not a moral exemplar, nor a cautionary tale. She does not offer comfort or certainty. Instead, she confronts humanity with its own complexity. Through her, people encountered the truth that creation and destruction are inseparable, that desire carries risk, and that power demands responsibility. Her legacy challenges the notion that divinity must be benevolent or orderly. Instead, she embodies a more unsettling truth, that the forces shaping existence are often contradictory, unpredictable, and deeply intertwined. To engage with them is to accept both their gifts and their dangers. In the end, Inanna stands not as a relic of ancient belief, but as a timeless symbol of transformation. Her stories remind us that growth requires confrontation with the unknown, that renewal often follows loss, and that true power lies not in control, but in the courage to face change. Through her, the ancient world articulated a profound understanding of existence, one that continues to resonate long after her temples have fallen into ruin. Her voice, carried through myth and memory, still speaks to those willing to listen. It speaks of cycles and crossings, of descent and return, of the enduring tension between order and chaos. And in that voice, echoing across millennia, the story of humanity itself can still be heard. As the memory of Inanna traveled through centuries, her image began to fracture into many reflections, each shaped by the culture that inherited her. Yet even as her name shifted and her stories adapted, the essential force she embodied remained unmistakable. She was never reduced to a single role or confined to a single narrative. Instead, she became a living current flowing through the evolving consciousness of the ancient world, shaping how people understood power, desire, fate, and the fragile balance between creation and annihilation. In the later phases of Mesopotamian civilization, as empires rose and fell with increasing speed, Inanna's presence took on an even more complex resonance. The world had grown larger, more interconnected, and more volatile. Trade routes extended across vast distances, wars reshaped borders, and kingship became increasingly centralized. In this changing environment, the goddess evolved into a figure who embodied not only cosmic forces, but also the anxieties of empire itself. As Ishtar, her Akkadian counterpart, she became inseparable from the ideology of kingship. Rulers no longer merely honored her, they depended on her. She was invoked before battles, credited with victories, and blamed for defeats. Her favor was understood as a tangible force that could tip the balance of history. To march under her protection was to believe oneself invincible, chosen, and justified. Yet this closeness to political power did not soften her nature. If anything, it intensified her volatility. The same goddess who granted kingship could revoke it without warning. In royal inscriptions, kings often proclaimed their devotion to Ishtar, while simultaneously expressing fear of her displeasure. This tension reflected a deeper truth. Power gained through divine favor was never secure. It required constant reaffirmation through ritual, obedience, and humility. The transformation of Inanna into Ishtar also reflected a shift in how societies understood violence. Warfare became more organized, more ideological, and more central to state identity. Ishtar, as a goddess of war, embodied this transformation. She was no longer simply a force of passion or instinct, but a strategist, a commander who led armies and determined outcomes. Her association with weapons, chariots, and military triumphs marked her as both protector and destroyer. Yet even in this martial aspect, her connection to love and fertility never disappeared. This duality created a potent symbolism. The same force that brought life could also bring death. Inanna Ishtar was not contradictory in this regard. She was comprehensive. She encompassed the full range of human experience, refusing to be reduced to a single moral dimension. Her myths from this period reflect a growing emphasis on power struggles, both divine and human. Stories of conflict between gods mirror the political realities of empires competing for dominance. Through these narratives, ancient societies explored questions of legitimacy, authority, and the costs of ambition. Inanna often appears at the center of these struggles, not as a passive observer, but as an instigator and arbiter. One of the most striking aspects of her enduring mythos is the way it confronts the concept of control. Inanna cannot be owned, mastered, or predicted. Those who attempt to use her for their own ends often find themselves undone. This theme resonates deeply with societies grappling with the limits of human power. Through her, the ancient world expressed an understanding that some forces, desire, fate, change, resist domination. Her association with sexuality also evolved during this period, taking on more symbolic and political dimensions. Sexual union was no longer merely an act of pleasure or fertility, but a metaphor for alliance, conquest, and transformation. The sacred marriage rite, once a communal celebration of renewal, became a potent symbol of royal authority. Through it, kings claimed a direct connection to divine power, asserting that their rule was sanctioned by the goddess herself. Yet even as her image was co-opted by political structures, Inanna retained an element of danger. She was never fully domesticated. Her myths continued to warn of the consequences of hubris, of overstepping bounds, of attempting to control what was meant to remain wild. In this way, she served as both patron and cautionary figure. As her worship spread, elements of her identity were absorbed into neighboring cultures, influencing later goddesses such as Astarte, Anat, and eventually even aspects of Aphrodite. Each adaptation reshaped her image, emphasizing different traits while preserving the core essence of her power. Through this process, Inanna became a bridge between cultures, a shared archetype that transcended linguistic and political boundaries. The endurance of her myth speaks to its psychological depth. Inanna represents the part of human experience that refuses simplification. She embodies contradiction, creation and destruction, love and cruelty, order and chaos. These tensions are not resolved within her story, they are embraced. This acceptance of complexity allowed her to remain relevant across vastly different historical contexts. In many ways, Inanna's legacy is a meditation on transformation itself. She teaches that change is not gentle, that growth often requires sacrifice, and that renewal emerges from disruption. Her descent into the underworld and return mirrors the cycles of nature, the rhythms of human life, and the inner journeys of loss and renewal that define existence. By embodying both the heights of power and the depths of vulnerability, Inanna became a mirror in which humanity could see itself reflected. She offered no easy comfort, no promise of moral clarity. Instead, she offered recognition, the acknowledgement that life is complex, contradictory, and perpetually in motion. As her worship gradually faded and new religious frameworks took hold, the essence of Inanna did not vanish. It persisted in stories, symbols, and archetypes that continued to shape cultural imagination. The fierce goddess who once ruled the heavens and the underworld alike became a shadow behind later myths, a silent influence shaping how humanity understood desire, power, and transformation. In this way, Inanna never truly disappeared. She became part of the deep structure of myth itself, an enduring presence woven into the collective unconscious. Her legacy reminds us that the forces she embodied, creation and destruction, love and violence, order and chaos, are not relics of an ancient past, but living realities that continue to shape the human story. Through her, we glimpse an ancient understanding of existence that remains startlingly relevant. That life is not a simple progression toward harmony, but a dynamic interplay of opposing forces. And it is within that tension, as Inanna herself demonstrates, that the true power of existence resides. As the centuries turned and civilizations layered themselves upon the ruins of their predecessors, the presence of Inanna did not fade into mythic obscurity. Instead, her essence diffused, embedded within cultural memory, shaping belief systems long after her temples fell silent. She became less a figure worshipped in stone halls and more an archetype woven into the unconscious patterns of human thought. Her influence persisted not through direct veneration, but through the stories humanity continued to tell about power, desire, transformation, and loss. In the eras that followed the decline of the great Mesopotamian city-states, new gods rose to prominence, each reflecting the evolving values of their societies. Yet within these newer deities, echoes of Inanna remained unmistakable. She survived through adaptation, her traits redistributed across pantheons. In some traditions, she appeared softened, transformed into goddesses of love and beauty. In others, her martial aspects dominated, recast as fierce protectors or destroyers. Though her name changed, her essence endured. This transformation was not accidental. The qualities embodied by Inanna, sexual autonomy, political authority, emotional intensity, and spiritual power, were too potent to disappear. Instead, they were reframed to fit shifting cultural norms. Where once she had ruled openly as a sovereign force, later societies fragmented her image, separating the acceptable from the dangerous. What remained was a shadow of her former totality, dispersed among multiple figures, each carrying a fragment of her original power. Despite these changes, the psychological imprint of Inanna remained unmistakable. In myths of later civilizations, echoes of her descent and return appear again and again. Stories of gods and heroes who journey into darkness and emerge transformed bear her signature. The motif of descent into the underworld, into madness, into exile, followed by return, rebirth, or enlightenment, reflects the same archetypal pattern she embodied millennia earlier. This pattern is not merely literary. It reflects a fundamental human experience. Loss, crisis, and transformation are universal. Inanna's story offered a framework through which ancient peoples could understand suffering not as an end, but as a passage. Her willingness to face annihilation without surrender gave shape to the idea that renewal requires surrender, that creation demands destruction. In this way, Inanna became a guide through psychological and spiritual thresholds. Her descent mirrored the inner journeys individuals faced in times of grief, change, or crisis. The underworld was not simply a place of death, but a realm of initiation. To pass through it was to emerge altered, bearing new insight or power. This concept would later echo through countless religious and philosophical traditions, from mystery cults to depth psychology. As societies evolved, the figure of Inanna continued to adapt, often beneath the surface of official doctrine. In patriarchal cultures that emphasized order and hierarchy, her more chaotic aspects were subdued or reinterpreted. Yet they never vanished entirely. They reappeared in myths of forbidden goddesses, dangerous women, and figures who defied authority. In these stories, the shadow of Inanna persisted, reminding listeners of a time when divine femininity was untamed and sovereign. Her influence can be traced in the enduring fascination with figures who embody both creation and destruction, figures who inspire devotion and fear in equal measure. These characters challenge social norms, disrupt hierarchies, and force confrontation with uncomfortable truths. They are descendants of Inanna, inheritors of her disruptive energy. Even in philosophical and religious traditions that sought to suppress or reinterpret the feminine divine, echoes of Inanna survived. The tension between order and chaos, reason and passion, restraint and excess continued to shape spiritual thought. In many ways, the struggle to contain or redefine the feminine mirrored the ancient attempt to domesticate Inanna's power. Yet she resisted containment. Her story endured not because it was preserved intact, but because it adapted. It resurfaced in myths of fallen angels, in tales of goddesses cast down and reborn, in allegories of death and resurrection. Wherever humanity grappled with the mysteries of existence, traces of her presence could be found. In the modern imagination, Inanna's legacy manifests in new forms. She appears in literature, psychology, and art as an archetype of transformation and rebellion. Scholars recognize her in patterns of mythic structure, while artists and thinkers draw inspiration from her defiance of boundaries. Her story resonates in narratives that explore identity, power, and the cost of self-realization. What makes her enduring is not merely her ancient origins, but her relevance to the human condition. Inanna represents the courage to descend into darkness without the guarantee of return. She embodies the willingness to confront one's own contradictions and to emerge changed. Her myth affirms that transformation is neither gentle nor optional. It is the price of growth. In a world that often seeks comfort and certainty, Inanna's legacy offers a different message. She teaches that meaning is forged through confrontation with uncertainty, that creation is inseparable from destruction, and that authenticity demands risk. Her story invites individuals to embrace complexity rather than flee from it. As modern societies grapple with rapid change, identity crises, and existential uncertainty, the ancient figure of Inanna speaks with renewed relevance. She reminds us that upheaval is not a failure, but a passage, that descent can be a prelude to renewal, and that the forces we fear may be the very ones that carry us forward. Through millennia of retelling, her essence remains undiminished. She is not confined to a single myth or culture, but exists wherever humans confront the boundaries of their own becoming. In this way, Inanna endures, not as a relic of the past, but as a living symbol of transformation, power, and the eternal cycle of becoming. Her story does not end because it cannot. It continues wherever change demands courage, wherever identity is forged through struggle, and wherever the old must die so that the new may be born. In this endless process, Inanna remains, guiding the descent and illuminating the path back to the light. As the memory of Inanna continued to echo through the long corridors of history, her presence began to take on a quieter, more subterranean form. No longer openly worshipped as the supreme goddess of cities and kings, she survived in fragments, embedded within symbols, absorbed into later deities, and encoded within stories that still carried her unmistakable imprint. Though her temples fell into ruin, the ideas she embodied did not disappear. They moved inward, becoming psychological, mythic, and cultural structures that continued to shape how people understood power, desire, and transformation. In later civilizations, where monotheistic frameworks increasingly dominated religious thought, the open worship of a goddess like Inanna became untenable. Yet the human need for what she represented did not vanish. Instead, her qualities were redistributed among saints, saints' legends, symbolic figures, and even abstract concepts. Her descent into the underworld became a metaphor for spiritual crisis. Her return became a symbol of renewal. Her fierce independence lived on in stories of rebellious heroines, dangerous queens, and women who refused to be defined by the boundaries imposed upon them. What is striking is how persistently her essential qualities re-emerge, even in cultures that consciously rejected the gods of the ancient world. The motif of the descent into darkness, madness, or death, followed by transformation, appears again and again in literature, philosophy, and religion. This pattern speaks to something deeply embedded in the human psyche, the understanding that growth requires confrontation with the unknown, and that rebirth is impossible without loss. In psychological terms, Inanna can be seen as a symbolic expression of the inner journey toward individuation. She represents the parts of the self that must be acknowledged rather than suppressed, the passions, fears, and contradictions that define human experience. Her descent mirrors the descent into the unconscious, where one confronts the shadow aspects of identity. Her return signifies integration, the emergence of a more complete self. This interpretation does not diminish her ancient power. Rather, it reveals why her story endures. Inanna's journey resonates because it reflects an internal truth that transcends culture and time. Every individual who faces crisis, loss, or transformation reenacts her descent in some form. Her myth offers a map for navigating these experiences, not by denying pain, but by moving through it. The enduring influence of Inanna can also be seen in artistic expression across centuries. From classical literature to modern poetry, from visual art to cinema, her archetype reappears in figures who challenge authority, embrace desire, and defy convention. These characters often provoke discomfort, yet they also inspire fascination. They are mirrors of the parts of ourselves that resist conformity and yearn for authenticity. In religious traditions that followed, particularly those emphasizing moral order and transcendence, traces of Inanna were often suppressed or reframed. Yet even in these systems, echoes of her presence remain. The themes of death and resurrection, of divine suffering and renewal, bear striking similarities to her ancient narrative. While the theological interpretations differ, the emotional and symbolic patterns remain consistent. What makes Inanna's legacy so enduring is her refusal to be reduced to a single meaning. She cannot be neatly categorized as benevolent or malevolent, nurturing or destructive. She embodies contradiction, and in doing so, reflects the complexity of existence itself. Her myths do not offer comfort through simplicity, but invite engagement with ambiguity. In modern times, this aspect of her story has found renewed relevance. As societies grapple with rapid change, environmental crises, and questions of identity, the themes embodied by Inanna resonate deeply. Her willingness to confront chaos, to descend into darkness rather than flee from it, offers a model for confronting uncertainty with courage rather than denial. The resurgence of interest in ancient mythologies has brought renewed attention to figures like Inanna, not as relics of a forgotten past, but as symbols of enduring human concerns. Scholars, artists, and thinkers continue to reinterpret her story, finding in it insights that speak to contemporary struggles. Her narrative serves as a reminder that transformation is often painful, but also necessary. In this sense, Inanna stands as a counterpoint to narratives that prioritize stability and control. She represents the truth that life is inherently unstable, and that meaning arises not from avoiding change, but from engaging with it fully. Her descent is not a fall from grace, but a necessary passage through darkness toward renewal. As the world continues to change, the ancient lessons embodied by Inanna remain relevant. She teaches that power must be balanced with vulnerability, that creation is inseparable from destruction, and that growth demands courage. Her story encourages an embrace of complexity rather than a retreat into simplicity. Through centuries of reinterpretation, Inanna has become more than a goddess. She is a symbol of humanity's ongoing struggle to understand itself. She stands at the crossroads of myth and psychology, history and imagination, reminding us that the deepest truths are often found not in certainty, but in transformation. In remembering her, we reconnect with a vision of existence that honors both light and shadow, strength and fragility. Her legacy endures not because it offers answers, but because it asks the questions that continue to shape human experience. In this way, Inanna remains alive, not as a relic of the past, but as a living presence in the stories we tell and the meanings we seek. Her journey, like our own, is never truly finished. It unfolds endlessly, inviting each generation to step into the depths, confront the unknown, and emerge changed. And in that eternal cycle of descent and return, the spirit of Inanna continues to move, guiding humanity through the ever-unfolding mystery of being. As the memory of Inanna continued to echo across generations, Her presence gradually moved from the center of ritual life into the deeper layers of cultural consciousness. She was no longer invoked openly as the supreme goddess of the land, yet her influence endured in subtler, more pervasive forms. Where temples once stood, myths remained. Where rituals faded, symbols endured. In this transformation, Inanna did not disappear. She evolved into an archetype embedded within the collective imagination. The ancient world had begun to change. Political structures grew more centralized, and divine authority was increasingly reorganized into hierarchical systems dominated by singular, all-encompassing deities. In such frameworks, the raw, untamed power that Inanna embodied became difficult to accommodate. Her complexity challenged systems that demanded order, obedience, and moral clarity. Yet even as official religion sought to streamline divinity, the emotional and psychological truths she represented could not be erased. In many traditions that followed, the qualities once embodied by Inanna re-emerged in fragmented forms. Her passion surfaced in goddesses of love and fertility. Her ferocity appeared in warrior figures and divine avengers. Her descent into darkness echoed in myths of death and rebirth. Though her name was often absent, her presence remained woven into the spiritual imagination of countless cultures. This transformation reflects a broader shift in how societies understood power and the divine. Early civilizations accepted contradiction as an inherent part of existence. Later traditions, seeking order and stability, often suppressed or compartmentalized it. Yet the human psyche continued to recognize what had been lost. Myths preserved what doctrine could not. The truth that life is shaped as much by chaos as by structure. Inanna's enduring influence is particularly evident in the evolution of feminine archetypes. She stands at the origin of a long lineage of figures who embody both creation and destruction, allure and danger. From goddesses of love and war to legendary queens and enchantresses, echoes of her presence reverberate across time. These figures often challenge authority, disrupt norms, and force transformation, hallmarks of Inanna's enduring legacy. Her story also reveals an ancient understanding of power that contrasts sharply with modern assumptions. Power, in Inanna's world, was not about control or domination alone. It was about the capacity to endure change, to confront fear, and to navigate contradiction. It required vulnerability as much as strength. This conception of power, though ancient, remains profoundly relevant in a world still grappling with imbalance and uncertainty. Inanna's descent into the underworld, in particular, continues to resonate as a profound metaphor for personal and collective transformation. It speaks to moments when structures collapse, identities dissolve, and familiar meanings fall away. Such experiences are often accompanied by fear and disorientation, yet they also carry the potential for renewal. The descent is not an end, but a passage, a necessary prelude to rebirth. This narrative has found expression in countless forms, from initiation rites to psychological theories of transformation. The journey inward, through darkness and uncertainty, emerges as a universal pattern of growth. In this sense, Inanna's myth transcends its cultural origins to become a map of human experience itself. Even in modern contexts, her story resonates with those who seek meaning amid upheaval. Artists, writers, and thinkers continue to draw inspiration from her defiance of convention and her embrace of complexity. She offers a model of strength that doesn't rely on domination, but on authenticity and resilience. Her power lies in her willingness to confront the unknown rather than flee from it. As societies evolve, the values embodied by Inanna remain strikingly relevant. In times of social transformation, her example encourages engagement rather than retreat, courage rather than conformity. She stands as a reminder that growth often requires confrontation with uncomfortable truths, and that transformation is rarely gentle. In a world increasingly shaped by rapid change and uncertainty, the ancient wisdom encoded in her myths offers perspective. It suggests that chaos is not merely destructive, but can be generative, that endings are inseparable from beginnings, and that renewal often arises from crisis. In this way, Inanna continues to speak across millennia, offering insight into the enduring rhythms of human existence. Her story, preserved through fragments and echoes, invites reflection on the nature of power, identity, and transformation. It challenges simplistic narratives and embraces complexity. Through her, we are reminded that the forces shaping our lives are neither wholly benevolent nor entirely destructive, but part of an ongoing dance of creation and dissolution. Ultimately, Inanna endures because she embodies the truths that humanity cannot escape. She represents the perpetual cycle of descent and return, loss and renewal, death and life. Her myth does not offer easy answers or comforting resolutions. Instead, it offers a mirror in which humanity can glimpse its own depths and contradictions. In this sense, Inanna is not merely a relic of ancient belief, but a living symbol of the human condition. Her story continues to resonate because it speaks to the fundamental experiences that define existence: desire, struggle, transformation, and renewal. Through her, the ancient world speaks to the present, reminding us that the journey through darkness is often the path to understanding. And so, even as the centuries pass and civilizations rise and fall, the essence of Inanna endures. She remains a figure of power and mystery, a testament to humanity's enduring quest to understand itself and the forces that shape its destiny. As centuries passed and civilizations transformed, the presence of Inanna gradually receded from public worship. Yet her essence remained deeply embedded within the structures of thought that shaped human understanding. Long after her temples crumbled and her priesthoods faded, the archetype she embodied continued to influence how people interpreted power, transformation, desire, and the fragile boundary between order and chaos. In this sense, Inanna did not disappear. She migrated inward, becoming a psychological and symbolic force rather than a public deity. This transformation mirrored the broader evolution of religious consciousness. As societies moved toward centralized authority and moralized systems of belief, the raw, untamed aspects of divinity that Inanna represented became increasingly uncomfortable. Her unapologetic autonomy, her refusal to conform to fixed moral categories, and her association with sexuality and destruction challenged emerging structures that prioritized stability and control. To preserve social order, such energies had to be subdued, reinterpreted, or hidden beneath layers of doctrine. Yet suppression did not mean extinction. Instead, Inanna's essence found new expressions in mythic figures who carried fragments of her identity. Goddesses of love, war, fertility, and transformation across various cultures bear unmistakable traces of her influence. Even when stripped of overt divinity, her qualities persisted in folklore, literature, and ritual. She became an undercurrent rather than a central figure, shaping narratives from behind the scenes. This transformation also occurred within the human psyche. As societies developed more rigid moral frameworks, the aspects of the self represented by Inanna, desire, ambition, instinct, and rebellion, were often repressed or moralized. Yet these forces did not vanish. They were internalized, shaping dreams, fears, and aspirations. In this sense, Inanna became an archetype of the unconscious, a representation of the energies that lie beneath conscious awareness. Her descent into the underworld can thus be understood as a metaphor for psychological descent, a journey into the hidden layers of the self, where suppressed emotions and truths reside. The pain and disorientation of that descent mirror the discomfort of confronting one's own shadow. Her return, however, affirms the possibility of integration and renewal. Through confrontation with the depths, transformation becomes possible. This interpretation aligns closely with later psychological theories that explore the necessity of facing one's inner darkness in order to achieve wholeness. Long before such ideas were articulated in modern terms, Inanna's myth gave them narrative form. She became a guide through the inner landscape, illustrating that wholeness cannot be achieved by denying parts of oneself, but by acknowledging and integrating them. In the broader cultural imagination, this made Inanna a powerful symbol of resilience. She did not emerge unscathed from her trials, nor did she pretend to. Her power lay not in invulnerability, but in endurance. She faced annihilation and returned transformed. This narrative resonated deeply with societies that endured cycles of collapse and renewal, war and reconstruction. As centuries passed and new belief systems took hold, the memory of Inanna's descent was reshaped to fit emerging worldviews. In some traditions, her story was recast as a moral allegory. In others, as a spiritual allegory of death and rebirth. Even where her name was forgotten, the pattern she embodied persisted. The idea that growth requires sacrifice, that enlightenment demands confrontation with darkness, became a recurring theme across cultures. In literature, art, and philosophy, echoes of Inanna's journey continued to surface. From mythic heroes who descend into the underworld to modern narratives of psychological transformation, the structure of her story remained intact. These retellings, whether conscious or not, carried forward the ancient understanding that transformation is rarely gentle and never without cost. In this way, Inanna's legacy transcended mythology to become a foundational element of human self-understanding. She represented the courage to face uncertainty, the willingness to lose in order to gain, and the strength to emerge changed. Her story affirmed that destruction is not always an end, but often a prelude to renewal. Even in contemporary contexts, where ancient gods are no longer worshipped, the archetype she embodies remains potent. Modern narratives of personal growth, psychological healing, and spiritual awakening frequently mirror the pattern of descent and return. The language may differ, but the structure remains unmistakably similar. In this sense, Inanna continues to speak through the stories humanity tells itself. Her enduring relevance lies in her refusal to offer easy answers. She does not promise salvation without sacrifice or transformation without pain. Instead, she presents a vision of existence in which growth is earned through confrontation with the unknown. This message resonates deeply in a world that often seeks quick solutions to complex problems. Inanna's legacy also challenges simplistic notions of good and evil. Her actions cannot be neatly categorized as moral or immoral. They operate on a different plane, one concerned with balance, necessity, and consequence. Through her, ancient cultures acknowledged that the forces shaping life are not always kind or just, but they are essential. As modern societies continue to grapple with rapid change, uncertainty, and transformation, the symbolic power of Inanna remains relevant. Her story offers a lens through which to understand upheaval not as failure, but as an integral part of growth. She teaches that to move forward, one must sometimes descend into darkness and emerge renewed. In this way, Inanna endures not merely as a figure of ancient myth, but as a living symbol embedded in the human psyche. Her presence reminds us that the path to transformation is rarely easy, but it is always necessary. Through her, the ancient world speaks to the present, offering wisdom born of struggle, resilience, and the unyielding drive toward renewal. And so, long after her temples have fallen and her name has faded from daily speech, Inanna continues to walk beside humanity, not as a goddess demanding worship, but as a guiding force within the timeless journey of becoming. As centuries passed and human civilizations evolved, the legacy of Inanna continued to shape the way people understood power, identity, and transformation, even when her name was no longer spoken aloud. The essence of her story did not disappear with the decline of ancient temples. Instead, it embedded itself into cultural memory, resurfacing in new forms whenever societies confronted change, upheaval, or rebirth. Her presence lingered not as a figure of worship, but as a symbolic force woven into the very fabric of human consciousness. In later eras, as religious systems became increasingly hierarchical and moralized, the raw intensity of Inanna's character posed a challenge. Her refusal to conform to rigid moral binaries made her difficult to reconcile with doctrines that sought clear distinctions between good and evil. As a result, aspects of her identity were divided and reassigned. Her power over fertility became sanctified, her sexuality restrained or reinterpreted, her ferocity reimagined as righteous wrath or divine judgment. Yet beneath these layers of reinterpretation, the original current of her nature remained intact. What made Inanna enduring was her embodiment of contradiction. She was both creator and destroyer, nurturer and adversary, sovereign and transgressor. These contradictions mirrored the human condition itself. Life, as experienced by humanity, is rarely consistent or predictable. It is shaped by opposing forces that coexist in tension. Inanna gave form to this reality, allowing ancient societies to articulate experiences that defied simple explanation. As cultures evolved, the language used to describe these experiences changed, but the underlying truths persisted. Philosophical traditions began to explore themes of inner conflict, transformation, and self-overcoming. Ideas that echoed Inanna's mythic descent and return. Though stripped of divine imagery, the core narrative endured. Growth requires confrontation with loss. Wisdom arises from struggle. Renewal follows dissolution. In the psychological realm, these themes found renewed expression in modern interpretations of the human psyche. The descent into darkness became a metaphor for confronting the unconscious, for facing repressed fears and desires. The ascent symbolized integration and healing. Without naming her, thinkers echoed Inanna's journey, acknowledging the necessity of engaging with the shadow in order to achieve wholeness. This continuity reveals something profound about the human condition. Across cultures and epochs, people have recognized that transformation demands sacrifice. Comfort must be relinquished, illusions dismantled, and identities reshaped. Inanna's story provided an early framework for understanding this process, one that resonated deeply because it mirrored lived experience. Her influence also persisted in artistic expression. Literature, music, and visual art continued to explore themes of descent, rebirth, and the tension between creation and destruction. Characters who descend into darkness and return changed, whether heroes, lovers, or wanderers, carry echoes of her myth. These narratives do not merely entertain, they reflect an enduring human need to make sense of suffering and renewal. In this way, Inanna's presence extends beyond religion into the realm of culture itself. She becomes a symbol through which societies explore transformation, power, and identity. Her story invites contemplation of what it means to lose oneself and to emerge transformed. It challenges the notion that progress is linear or that growth comes without cost. The persistence of her myth also reveals something about memory and continuity. Even as languages die and civilizations fall, certain stories endure because they speak to fundamental human experiences. Inanna's narrative survives not because it was preserved intact, but because it was continually reimagined. Each generation reshaped her to reflect its own fears, hopes, and understanding of the world. In the modern era, where individuals grapple with rapid change and existential uncertainty, the themes embodied by Inanna feel strikingly relevant. Her story speaks to the necessity of facing upheaval with courage, of acknowledging the darker aspects of existence rather than denying them. She represents the courage to descend into the unknown and the resilience required to return transformed. This enduring relevance suggests that Inanna is less a figure of ancient religion than a mirror reflecting humanity's ongoing struggle with transformation. Her narrative offers no easy resolutions, no promises of eternal stability. Instead, it affirms that change is inevitable and that meaning emerges through engagement with life's complexities. Through this lens, Inanna becomes a guide rather than a deity, an archetype illustrating the cycles that govern both nature and human experience. Her journey reminds us that destruction can be a prelude to creation, that loss can precede renewal, and that the path to understanding often passes through darkness. As history moves forward, the names and symbols may change, but the essence of her story endures. It lives in myths of rebirth, in rites of passage, in stories of resilience and transformation. Wherever humans confront the unknown and emerge altered, the spirit of Inanna can be felt. In this way, she remains a silent companion to humanity's ongoing evolution. Her presence is not bound to temples or texts, but woven into the patterns of experience that define what it means to be human. Through her, the ancient world continues to speak, reminding us that the journey through darkness is not an end, but a passage toward deeper understanding. Thus, Inanna's legacy endures, not as a relic of the past, but as an ever-present force shaping how humanity understands change, identity, and the enduring cycle of renewal. As time moved forward and civilizations continued to rise and collapse, the figure of Inanna became less a deity bound to temples and more a living principle woven into the architecture of human consciousness. Her myths, though fragmented and reshaped by centuries of retelling, continued to function as vessels for understanding transformation, power, and the complex nature of existence itself. What began as sacred narrative evolved into a deep psychological and cultural inheritance, carried silently across generations. In societies where the divine gradually withdrew from everyday life, the qualities once embodied by Inanna did not disappear. Instead, they migrated inward. The confrontation with chaos, the negotiation between desire and restraint, and the necessity of transformation became internalized experiences. The goddess who once walked among mortals became an internal presence, manifesting in dreams, myths, and symbolic expressions of the human psyche. This internalization marked a significant shift in how meaning was constructed. Where ancient peoples experienced the divine as an external force acting upon the world, later cultures began to experience it as something arising from within. Inanna's descent into the underworld became less a literal journey and more a metaphor for inner descent, a confrontation with fear, loss, and the unknown regions of the self. Her return signified integration, the reconciliation of fragmented aspects of identity. This inward turn gave rise to new ways of understanding suffering and transformation. Rather than viewing hardship solely as punishment or fate, it became possible to see it as a necessary stage in growth. Inanna's story offered a model in which descent was not failure, but preparation. Darkness was not an end, but a threshold. Such ideas resonated deeply in philosophical and spiritual traditions that sought meaning beyond surface appearances. As these concepts spread, they influenced emerging systems of thought that sought to explain the human condition. In myths, literature, and later philosophical writings, the pattern of descent and return became a foundational narrative. Heroes descended into caves, underworlds, or psychological depths, only to emerge changed. These stories echoed the ancient rhythm first articulated in the myths of Inanna. Her influence also shaped perceptions of femininity and power. Unlike later idealizations of passive virtue, Inanna represented an active, assertive force. She did not wait to be chosen. She chose. She did not accept limitations imposed upon her. She challenged them. This portrayal offered a powerful alternative to restrictive gender norms, suggesting that strength, desire, and authority were not exclusive to masculinity. Over time, this aspect of her identity was both celebrated and feared. Societies that valued control and order often struggled with such a figure, attempting to temper or suppress her influence. Yet even when constrained, her essence persisted, surfacing in stories of rebellious women, divine tricksters, and figures who defied societal expectations. These characters carried forward the spirit of Inanna, even when her name was forgotten. The persistence of her archetype speaks to a deeper truth about human psychology. People are drawn to figures who embody the full spectrum of experience, who reflect both light and darkness. Inanna's power lies not in perfection, but in completeness. She encompasses joy and sorrow, creation and destruction, love and rage. In doing so, she mirrors the complexity of human existence itself. As cultures evolved, the contexts in which her archetype appeared changed, but its core remained recognizable. In medieval literature, in Renaissance art, and even in modern storytelling, echoes of her journey can be found. Characters who descend into darkness to reclaim lost parts of themselves, who confront inner demons and emerge transformed, follow a path she first charted millennia ago. In psychological terms, this enduring pattern speaks to the universal process of individuation, the integration of conscious and unconscious elements into a cohesive self. Inanna's descent embodies this process in mythic form. She does not conquer the underworld, she endures it. She does not escape unscathed, she is altered. Through this transformation, she becomes whole. This understanding challenges simplistic notions of heroism. Rather than depicting strength as invulnerability, Inanna's story suggests that true power lies in the willingness to face vulnerability. It is through surrender, not domination, that transformation occurs. This perspective offers a counterpoint to narratives that glorify conquest and control, emphasizing instead the value of introspection and resilience. As modern societies grapple with rapid change, existential uncertainty, and psychological fragmentation, the relevance of such themes becomes increasingly apparent. The ancient story of descent and return speaks to contemporary experiences of loss, identity crisis, and renewal. It offers a framework for understanding transformation not as failure, but as an essential part of growth. In this sense, Inanna's legacy transcends time and culture. She is not confined to the ancient world, but lives on in the symbolic language through which humans interpret their experiences. Her story continues to resonate because it addresses fundamental questions about existence. How do we confront loss? How do we emerge from darkness? How do we integrate opposing forces within ourselves? Through these questions, Inanna remains present, not as a distant deity, but as a guide through the complexities of human life. Her narrative affirms that transformation is not a linear process, but a cyclical one, marked by descent and renewal. It reminds us that to become whole, we must be willing to face the depths as well as the heights. In the end, Inanna's enduring power lies in her ability to speak to the human condition across time. She is not bound by era or belief system. She exists wherever people seek meaning in change, courage in uncertainty, and hope in the face of darkness. Her story, endlessly retold and reinterpreted, continues to offer insight into the timeless journey of becoming. As the long arc of history continued to unfold, the presence of Inanna became less visible in temples and texts, yet more deeply rooted in the structures of thought that governed how human beings understood power, identity, and transformation. Her disappearance from overt worship did not signify an ending, but a transition, one that carried her essence into new forms of cultural expression. What once existed as ritual and myth gradually transformed into philosophy, symbolism, and psychology, where her influence continued to shape the human imagination in subtler ways. In societies that increasingly favored order, law, and rational structure, the raw and untamed qualities embodied by Inanna became difficult to contain. Her defiance of hierarchy, her refusal to submit, and her embrace of contradiction challenged systems that relied on clarity and control. As a result, her presence was often fragmented, absorbed into other archetypes, or pushed to the margins of acceptable belief. Yet even when suppressed, her energy did not disappear. It re-emerged in altered forms, sometimes as inspiration, sometimes as anxiety. The transformation of Inanna from a living deity into a symbolic force parallels the evolution of human consciousness itself. As societies grew more complex, they increasingly sought to categorize and regulate experience. The chaotic, ecstatic, and uncontrollable aspects of existence, once personified by goddesses like Inanna, became harder to accommodate. Yet these forces remained essential. They manifested in art, in dreams, in moments of rebellion, and in the recurring human fascination with transgression and renewal. In literary traditions that followed, the echoes of Inanna's narrative can be traced through countless stories of descent and return. Heroes journey into underworlds, confront their fears, and emerge transformed. Though the names and settings change, the underlying structure remains strikingly similar. This enduring pattern suggests that Inanna's story taps into a fundamental psychological truth. Transformation requires descent, and growth demands confrontation with the unknown. As the world moved into eras dominated by monotheistic belief systems, the overt worship of goddesses diminished, yet the need to engage with the forces they represented did not. Instead, these forces were often internalized or projected onto abstract concepts. Where once Inanna embodied desire and destruction, now these forces were reframed as internal struggles, moral challenges, or existential dilemmas. The goddess was no longer invoked by name, but her influence persisted in the human psyche. This transition marked a shift in how people understood responsibility and agency. Rather than attributing fate to the whims of a goddess, individuals were increasingly encouraged to see themselves as accountable for their actions. Yet the underlying dynamics remained strikingly similar. The internal conflicts people faced mirrored the external dramas once enacted by the gods. In this sense, Inanna's journey from divine figure to psychological archetype reflects humanity's evolving relationship with power and meaning. In modern times, her presence can be felt in narratives that explore identity, transformation, and the tension between order and chaos. Literature, film, and art continue to revisit themes of descent, rebirth, and self-discovery, often unconsciously echoing the ancient patterns she embodied. Characters who confront their darkest selves, who lose everything only to emerge renewed, are heirs to the path she once walked. Moreover, Inanna's legacy challenges simplistic notions of morality. Her story does not offer clear distinctions between right and wrong, good and evil. Instead, it presents a world in which growth arises from contradiction and where moral certainty gives way to complexity. This perspective resonates in contemporary discourse, where rigid binaries increasingly fail to capture the nuances of human experience. The persistence of her influence suggests that certain truths transcend historical context. The need to confront inner darkness, to integrate conflicting aspects of the self, and to find meaning through transformation are universal human experiences. Inanna's myth provides a language for these processes, one that remains relevant even as cultural frameworks change. In this light, her enduring significance lies not in the specifics of ancient ritual, but in the timeless questions her story raises. Who are we when stripped of our identities? What must we relinquish to grow? How do we reconcile opposing forces within ourselves? These questions continue to shape philosophical, psychological, and spiritual inquiry. As humanity advances into an increasingly complex future, the wisdom encoded in Inanna's myth offers a reminder that progress is not linear. Growth often requires descent, and understanding emerges from confronting what is hidden. Her story encourages engagement with the unknown, urging individuals to face uncertainty with courage rather than avoidance. Ultimately, Inanna represents the deep currents that run beneath the surface of civilization. She is the embodiment of transformation itself, unceasing, unpredictable, and essential. Through her, we are reminded that change is not an enemy to be feared, but a force to be understood and embraced. Though her name may fade from common memory, the patterns she represents endure. In every moment of crisis that leads to renewal, in every journey through darkness toward insight, her presence can be felt. She remains a silent companion to humanity's ongoing evolution, a testament to the enduring power of myth to illuminate the human condition. In acknowledging her legacy, we recognize that the ancient stories we inherit are not relics of a distant past, but living frameworks through which we continue to interpret our lives. Inanna's story endures because it speaks to something timeless within us, a recognition that transformation, though painful, is the path through which meaning is forged. As the long arc of human history continued to unfold, the presence of Inanna became less a figure of overt worship and more a deep current running beneath the surface of collective consciousness. Her story, once carved into clay tablets and sung in temple courts, transformed into a symbolic framework through which humanity continued to understand change, loss, power, and renewal. Though the language changed, the essence endured. Inanna did not vanish, she became internalized. By this stage in cultural evolution, humanity no longer required gods to walk openly among them. Instead, meaning was sought in philosophy, art, and personal experience. Yet the questions that Inanna once embodied, questions of desire, ambition, mortality, and transformation, remained unresolved. The goddess lived on not as a figure of worship, but as a pattern embedded in the human psyche. She became a mirror through which people could confront their own contradictions. The mythic descent that once described a goddess entering the underworld now took on psychological dimensions. The journey downward became an inward passage, a confrontation with grief, fear, and the unknown aspects of the self. The ascent that followed represented healing, integration, and renewal. In this way, Inanna's story became a template for understanding inner transformation long before the language of psychology existed. This transformation of myth into metaphor allowed Inanna's essence to survive even as religious frameworks shifted. Where temples crumbled and priesthoods vanished, her story endured in poetry, folklore, and later in philosophical thought. Writers and thinkers found in her narrative a way to express the complexities of human experience that resisted simple moral categories. Her legacy is particularly evident in the recurring theme of descent as a necessary precursor to growth. Across cultures and eras, stories emerge of individuals who must lose everything: status, certainty, identity, before they can be reborn. This pattern, deeply rooted in Inanna's descent, speaks to a universal truth: that profound change often requires surrender rather than control. In modern contexts, this idea resonates strongly. Psychological growth, emotional healing, and creative transformation often involve confronting uncomfortable truths and dismantling old identities. In this sense, Inanna's journey mirrors the internal processes individuals undergo during periods of crisis or transition. Her story validates the experience of being lost as a necessary step toward becoming whole. The persistence of her influence also reveals humanity's enduring need for symbols that acknowledge complexity. In a world increasingly defined by rigid categories and simplified narratives, Inanna stands as a reminder that reality is rarely binary. She embodies contradiction without seeking to resolve it, offering a model for embracing ambiguity rather than fearing it. Her relevance extends beyond personal transformation into the realm of collective experience. Societies, like individuals, undergo cycles of rise, collapse, and renewal. The fall of empires, the reshaping of cultures, and the redefinition of values all echo the same pattern of descent and rebirth found in her myth. In this way, Inanna serves as a symbolic guide through periods of upheaval and change. The endurance of her story also highlights humanity's need for myth as a means of understanding existence. Myths do not provide empirical explanations. They offer frameworks through which experience can be interpreted and meaning can be constructed. Inanna's myth, with its rich complexity and emotional depth, provides a lens through which to view the tensions between creation and destruction, freedom and constraint. In contemporary contexts, her influence can be felt in narratives that challenge conventional notions of heroism and morality. Characters who defy expectations, who navigate moral ambiguity, and who undergo profound inner change often mirror the archetypal journey she represents. Through them, her legacy continues to shape modern storytelling. Moreover, the enduring appeal of Inanna speaks to a deep-seated human desire to reconcile opposing forces within ourselves. She embodies both vulnerability and strength, passion and restraint, chaos and order. By holding these opposites together, she offers a model of wholeness that does not require simplification or denial. In a world increasingly driven by binary thinking, her story serves as a reminder of the value of complexity. It encourages a more nuanced understanding of identity, one that embraces contradiction as a source of richness rather than confusion. Through Inanna, we are reminded that growth often emerges from tension, not resolution. Her legacy also challenges the notion that progress must follow a linear path. Instead, it suggests a cyclical understanding of time and development, where endings give rise to new beginnings. This perspective offers comfort in times of uncertainty, emphasizing that decline and renewal are intertwined aspects of existence. As humanity continues to grapple with profound questions about meaning, identity, and the future, the ancient voice of Inanna remains relevant. She speaks not through commandments or doctrines, but through patterns that resonate across time. Her story invites reflection rather than obedience, exploration rather than certainty. In this way, Inanna transcends the boundaries of myth and becomes a symbol of the human journey itself. She represents the courage to descend into darkness, the resilience to endure transformation, and the wisdom to emerge changed. Her legacy is not confined to the past. It lives on in every moment of self-discovery and every act of renewal. Thus, the story of Inanna continues, not as a relic of ancient belief, but as an enduring narrative woven into the fabric of human experience. Through her, we are reminded that to live fully is to embrace both the light and the shadow, and that within the cycle of loss and renewal lies the deepest truth of existence. As the long echo of Inanna's story reaches its final resonance, what remains is not a conclusion, but a continuation. A living current that flows quietly beneath the surface of human awareness. Her narrative, shaped across millennia, does not end in triumph or defeat, but in persistence. It endures because it speaks to something fundamental and unresolved within the human condition. The tension between creation and destruction, order and chaos, surrender and will. In the modern world, where technological advancement has reshaped nearly every aspect of existence, the ancient language of myth may seem distant, yet the forces Inanna embodied remain unmistakably present. The struggle to define identity in an ever-shifting world, the desire to assert meaning amid uncertainty, and the courage required to confront inner darkness are as relevant now as they were in the earliest cities of human civilization. In this sense, Inanna's story has not ended. It has simply changed form. What distinguishes her legacy from many others is the refusal to offer easy resolution. There is no final triumph that erases suffering, no ultimate harmony that negates struggle. Instead, her narrative affirms that transformation is cyclical, recurring, and often painful. This perspective stands in contrast to narratives that promise permanent salvation or absolute order. Inanna's wisdom lies in her acceptance of perpetual becoming. As societies evolved, this worldview found expression in countless forms: philosophical, artistic, and psychological. The idea that growth requires confrontation with uncertainty became central to human self-understanding. Inanna's descent into darkness, followed by her return, mirrors the rhythms of individual development, the breaking down of old identities and the gradual emergence of new ones. It is a process that cannot be rushed or avoided, only endured. Her influence can be traced in the ways people confront loss and transformation. Moments of grief, failure, or disorientation often mark turning points that reshape identity. In such moments, individuals experience their own descent into grief, doubt, or despair before finding a renewed sense of purpose. Inanna's story offers a framework for understanding these experiences not as signs of weakness, but as essential phases of growth. In a world increasingly defined by uncertainty and rapid change, this perspective carries profound relevance. The pace of modern life often demands adaptation at a scale previously unimaginable. Social structures shift, identities evolve, and long-held assumptions are challenged. In this context, the ancient wisdom embodied by Inanna provides a reminder that transformation, however unsettling, is a natural and necessary process. Her enduring significance also lies in her refusal to conform to idealized notions of perfection. She is flawed, contradictory, and unapologetically complex. Through her, the ancient world acknowledged that wholeness does not require purity or consistency. Instead, it emerges from the integration of opposing forces. This insight remains deeply relevant in a contemporary world that often struggles with binary thinking. Inanna's legacy invites a reimagining of strength. Rather than equating strength with dominance or control, her story emphasizes resilience, adaptability, and the courage to face vulnerability. She embodies a form of power that is dynamic rather than static, relational rather than authoritarian. This vision offers an alternative to models of power that rely on suppression or fear. As humanity confronts global challenges that demand cooperation, empathy, and adaptability, the values embodied by Inanna take on renewed significance. Her story encourages a recognition of interconnectedness between individuals, communities, and the natural world. It reminds us that transformation is not an isolated act, but a collective process shaped by shared experience. The endurance of her myth also highlights the human need for narrative continuity. Across cultures and epochs, people have returned to stories that articulate the rhythms of loss and renewal. Inanna's journey, with its descent and return, offers a template through which individuals and societies can make sense of change. It affirms that even in moments of profound disruption, there exists the potential for regeneration. In reflecting on her legacy, it becomes clear that Inanna is less a figure of the past than a presence woven into the ongoing story of humanity. She represents the capacity to face uncertainty without retreat, to embrace complexity without surrendering to chaos. Her story encourages engagement with the full spectrum of experience, rather than retreat into simplicity or denial. Ultimately, Inanna's enduring power lies in her refusal to offer easy answers. She does not promise redemption without struggle or growth without loss. Instead, she embodies the truth that transformation is an ongoing process, one that demands courage, resilience, and a willingness to confront the unknown. As humanity continues to navigate an ever-changing world, the lessons embedded in her myth remain profoundly relevant. In times of upheaval, her story offers not comfort, but perspective. It reminds us that change, however unsettling, is the engine of renewal, and that within every ending lies the potential for a new beginning. In this way, Inanna's journey continues, not as a relic of ancient belief, but as a living narrative that speaks to the deepest aspects of human experience. She endures not because she offers certainty, but because she reflects the truth of transformation itself. Through her, we are reminded that to live fully is to embrace the cycles of descent and ascent, loss and renewal that define the human story.